computer is picking up a strange signal. Here, sir, you better take a look at it.
Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm Liz J. Bradley, a science fiction author and poet who adores short fiction and snacks. Each episode of Sci-Fi Snacks is a short and sweet, or salty, discussion of what I loved, what I learned, and what I snacked on while reading new-to-me short science fiction. As always, links to the short stories are in the show notes, so if you haven't read this week's story, head on over, pick up your favorite snack, and then join me as we discuss this week's story. So I want to put out a content warning for this episode. We are going to be talking about some pretty heavy topics in terms of violation of personal boundaries and cannibalism and death and all of those things involving children. So if this is not the right time for you to be listening, please take care of yourself and feel free to skip this episode or come back at a time that feels safe for you. Thanks. Hey everyone, and welcome back to episode 14, or episode 2 of season 2 of Sci-Fi Snacks. This week, we are talking about the story Monstress. This is a comic book, so I know the premise of the podcast is that we talk about short science fiction. We have pushed into novelette territory before. We have gone all the way down to microfiction. But when I was planning this season, Monstress came up as a really great representation of the steampunk subgenre. And what I found through a lot of my research was that steampunk is such a visual subgenre. Now, one of the things that I really like to explore in creative spaces is how different pieces translate. So, everybody's usually like, oh, the book was better. But there are times where you have something where, like Daisy Jones and the Six, the audiobook is the superior way to kind of experience that. Now, I have not seen the short series, but I've heard that it's also amazing. And I can only imagine once you add the actual music to that going and reading the book, Daisy Jones and the Six, which is kind of this interview style, the experience would feel incomplete if you know that there's an experience out there where you get all of the different voices and then where you get the visuals and the music. So I really kind of wanted to take the opportunity for this episode to explore the subgenre of steampunk in a more visual medium. Now, this comic book, there is a collection where I think they pull together the first 6 issues and they call it a graphic novel compilation. For this podcast, I read the first issue, which you can read for free online. I'll link that in the show notes. When you look at it, it's 71 pages long, I believe. But in terms of word count, it fits right in with the premise of this podcast, where it's short fiction. It's not a full-length novel, but there's definitely something to be added with that visual component. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on how that was a really different experience for me as a reader, as somebody who doesn't read a lot of comic books and never really did read a lot of comic books growing up. This was really interesting for me. As I had already said, this week's genre is steampunk in our punk series. More specifically, this is steampunk meets kaiju in this original fantasy epic for mature readers. So we're also scooching a little into fantasy as opposed to sci-fi. I like to blur the lines. Now we have both an author and an illustrator that's 2 separate people, so I'm going to give you their bios now because it's really impressive. Our author for Monstress is Marjorie Liu, and the illustrator is Sana Takeda. Marjorie Liu is an attorney and a New York Times best-selling author of over 19 novels. She is the co-creator of the Eisner-nominated series Monstress, published by Image Comics. Her comic book work includes X-23, Black Widow, Dark Wolverine, and Astonishing X-Men, for which she was nominated for a GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Media Images of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community. She currently teaches a course on comic book writing at MIT. Sana Takeda is a comic artist from Japan. She is a Japanese Hugo and Eisner Award-winning illustrator and comic book artist. After having worked as a designer at Sega Corp, she became a freelancer. While drawing for Marvel, she also creates illustrations for games and children's books. Her representative work is Monstress. Now, in terms of snacks for this week, this was one of those moments where the snack was immediately clear to me that if I was reading something called Monstress, I wanted monster cookies. Now, if you've never had a monster cookie before, what they are is essentially this mashup of peanut butter, chocolate chip, and M&M cookies all in one. So it's like all of the different types of cookies just in one bowl, and then you roll them out and you cook them, and they're just amazing. And because I am who I am, I decided I didn't want just regular M&Ms. And when I was at the store, I found mini peanut butter M&Ms. A lot of people will say that they are like Reese's, but in my personal opinion, and maybe this is unpopular, I don't know, but I think peanut butter M&Ms are better than Reese's Pieces because there is that teeny bit of chocolate in there. A Reese's Pieces is good, but it's just the peanut butter in the shell. And like an actual Reese's cup has the chocolate. And so Reese's Pieces, to me, can be a little overwhelming in the peanut butter department. But when you look at peanut butter M&Ms, it's just the perfect balance. And then I saw they had these mini ones in this bag that was perfect. And I was like, great. Monster cookie, throw it in. So really, you can kind of do whatever you want with these monster cookie recipes. You can throw in, I don't know, Oreo pieces, other types of chips, like toffee chips would probably be good. I probably wouldn't go with any sort of like mint. I know they have Andy's mint chips. And for me, mint is just too overwhelming. When you mix it with other stuff, it takes over. So I wouldn't go that route. But really, monster cookies are a great place for self-expression. So we talked about it a little bit, but steampunk, I think, is one of the more recognizable punk subgenres. It's definitely one that was easier to find stories for, which is kind of why I wanted to go with this unique story. We will probably read another steampunk, more traditional short story later on in this season, but I wanted to start with the definition. So the official definition of steampunk is a subgenre of science fiction that incorporates retrofuturistic technology and aesthetics prominently inspired by 19th century industrial steam-powered machinery and design. Steampunk works are often set in an alternative history of the Victorian era or the American frontier, where steam power remains in mainstream use, or in a fantasy world that similarly employs steam power. Steampunk features anachronistic technologies or retrofuturistic inventions. And what I really liked is Monstress is not set in kind of your Victorian era. It's definitely got that Japanese kaiju influence. So in kaiju, for anybody who doesn't know, like think Godzilla. Big, scary monsters. Godzilla being the most popular of that. So this kind of took that steampunk vibe and smashed it together with the rich history of Japanese kaiju monsters and created a world surrounding that. And I think that's a really important and good part of this conversation, is that steampunk does not have to be in Victorian England. So if that's the only thing you relate with steampunk, know that there's a wider world out there of steampunk-inspired stories that are really pretty cool for you to discover, starting today with Monstress. So Monstress is a story about this young main character. Her name is Micah, and she has a psychic link with this incredibly powerful monster. This is that kaiju connection. And she is on this journey of revenge. In the very beginning, we find out that she is at this auction, essentially, where they're auctioning off these hybrid human monster type children to the highest bidder. And we're like, we have no idea what's happening. We don't know why she's there. We get the hint that she's there on purpose and that she had been there before and she never wanted to be back, but she had to be there. And we come to find out it's because she wants revenge against this witch who ends up buying her instead of this really creepy, awful man. So she gets bought by this witch along with kind of the other monster children. And then she's got access. She's exactly where she wants. She's in this castle or compound in the dungeon with all these other children. And what we find out is that the witches here get a lot of their power from eating these monster children. So they not only torture them and kill them eventually, but they will take pieces of them. And our main character, you can see that she's missing an arm. And we don't quite find out in this episode, like, how she lost the arm. We do see her in the past with it, but we don't figure that out if somebody has taken it from her or if it was part of the war between the witches and the monster people, children. But we find out that she is there and she is going to fight these witches and get her revenge because she believes that this grandmother witch betrayed Micah's mother and I believe ended in her death. She's been sold at auction and she comes here and then she kind of fights her way out of this dungeon and protects the other monster children. Most of them escape. There's this really, really cute fox child monster. I hate calling them monsters because, like, honestly, the art, they were adorable. So this really cute, like, little fox kid follows her and it's like, hey, you're really good at killing and I think you'll help keep me alive. And she's like, why are you here? But, like, it's that dynamic. I love that trope of, like, you know, the cute kid is following the warrior. So we've got that, and she finally enacts her revenge on this witch. And we get some flashbacks where we see that during the war, Micah had this kind of connection to this big monster, but we only get a glimpse of it. And so I would say the only thing that was tough for me and different from a short story is that this was issue 1 in a comic book, and there wasn't a lot of resolution. It was a really cool start to a series, and I'm on the fence on whether or not I'll read more. I think I'm going to just find summaries and read them because I want to know what happens story-wise, but this was intense. There was a lot of blood and gore and, you know, dismembering of little children, monster cuteness, and I think it was more intense than I initially expected. So I don't think that this is one that I will be spending a ton of time with, but I do want to know that, you know, we opened all these doors, which is a great way to start like a book or a comic book series, is by introducing all of these really cool and interesting kind of threads of story, but not really all of them got resolved. So we had the resolution of this revenge arc, enough for like a story arc where there is change and, you know, choices are made and things like that. But because it's the beginning of something much, much bigger, there are still a lot of questions and kind of just this little peek at what I thought was one of the really hooky, interesting parts of this whole series, which was that psychic connection with this huge monster. And it's this small girl, and she's apparently killed thousands, or this monster has killed thousands. We don't really know. So I will definitely be figuring that out by reading some summaries or something like that. So I am obsessed with this art. And right now, wherever you're listening, if you're driving, like, don't stop or do anything dangerous. But like, I need you to go to the link in the show notes and check out this art. It is gorgeous. I think the talent of our illustrator, Sana Takeda, is off the charts. And this is what really solidified that steampunk vibe for me, was all of the visuals of this kind of like Victorian aesthetic. It was so clear. It was so clear in all of her art. She has this amazing talent to tell us a story. You know, if you took away all the words in this comic book, you could still figure out the story, I think. And that says something about the storytelling through the artwork, which is not something that a short story regularly does. You know, I know as an author, art is something that even with publication, art is not a guarantee. And then art, it's something that enhances your story. It doesn't tell your story. So if you've got a novel and you've got like the little, you know, pictures at the beginning of the chapters, or even your cover, like those aren't telling the story. They should enhance it. They should act as a piece of marketing material. Obviously, like your cover should tell some sort of story and give some sort of vibe, but it's not, you know, if you strip it all back and you have just the words, you still have the full story. In this case, in the comic books, I think if you were to take away the art, the words alone could not carry the whole story. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying anything like, oh, you don't need someone to write the story, because obviously the story is more than just words on a page. And I think that that's what I really, really learned from this one, is I had to sit with this for a little while about how the storytelling is so different than what I do, but there are lessons that we can take from it. I think if you want to be a writer, reading comic books can really show you how stripped back and how sparse your words can be, and you can still tell a story. Now, in this case, I do think the art is necessary, which makes sense, like it's a comic book, but there's a lesson there for the overwriters listening, or the people who are just starting out. Like maybe look at that, like how do you tell a story in its essence in the least amount of words possible? There were so many times where it was just dialogue or even sound effects, like sound effect words. That's something I learned, is that I don't know how to like place sound effect words. There are times where I would look at something and I was like, okay, that's not a word, that's a sound effect. And then I'd have to look at the art and I was like, what is that? I think that's a me problem where, you know, we're not talking like bam, pow, blam, like the pop art superheroes fighting or whatever. It was more like guttural sounds, and like it usually did happen during fights and stuff, but yeah, my brain does not translate the onomatopoeia of kind of those expressions very well. So that was something that I learned about myself. But I think that what they did so well was they really leaned into the strength of the medium that they were working in. So the art showed the steampunk vibes that the text alone could not. And so like with the audiobook and the movie series and things like that, when you lean into the strengths of the medium, you create something that's greater than its parts. You know, the whole is greater than its parts. And I thought that was a really cool thing. And I think that it's important when we decide we have a story to tell, especially if you're someone who wants to write in different styles. You know, I write poetry. I'm trying to write a play. I've got short fiction. I've got long fiction. It's worth it to stop and have the conversation or the thought with myself at the beginning of what medium would tell this story the best way. And maybe it isn't a novel. You know, maybe it's a poem. Maybe it's a song. Maybe it's something, you know, and if it is something that's like, oh, this would be a really good comic book, or this would be a really good song, or this would be a really great like movie, maybe I'm not the one to tell it, you know? And so it's looking at what is the best way to tell this story. I think a lot of people get cranky when their favorite books get translated into movies because of this, because the mediums have different strengths. And I think maybe it's the controversial opinion, but there are movies out there that are better than the book because the story that they're telling is better in that format. or they change things from the book because you can do things in a movie that you can't do in a book. And why wouldn't you? Because it's about the story. It's not about, people joke that they would sit through, a 7-hour movie of their favorite book where it's just like word for word and you can follow it. Like, cool. And maybe because I'm the person who has like that immersive experience in my own brain, that does not appeal to me. I don't need the movie from the book in my brain. Like, I've already seen that movie. I want to see your interpretation as an expert in your field, what that would be. And I think that Monstress, like, the reason that it's so popular is because it just does such a great job using the art and this format of storytelling. Is really cool. And then kind of the last thing that I learned here was about the genre in general. Steampunk, like I said, is really popular, but I think one of the reasons that I think we see it again and again and again is because it's blendable. You can put this in different places. They don't all have to be Victorian steampunk stories. And yes, there are a million of those. But, the marketing here was steampunk meets kaiju. And yes, 100%, that is what you get in this series. I think it really does well because it draws on the strengths of each of those. So we get all of these anachronistic technology moments from the steampunk genre. But then we get this, one of the things I loved about Godzilla is like, it's this big monster, but then the world, everything else in the world is the same. It's just, here's this big crazy monster invading Japan, and everything else is the same. So we get that kind of mashing together and blending of these two genres that work with these anachronisms. And the anachronisms all hold hands and create this beautiful, albeit intense, I say beautiful in terms of art, this really cohesive story and vibe for Monstress. So I think that's pretty great. And bringing it all around to the real reason we're here, the snack. Did the snack pair well? Of course, we are mixing kaiju and steampunk, and here we're mixing peanut butter cookies and chocolate chip cookies and M&M cookies, and you put them all together and you get something that's better than the pieces. The whole is greater than the parts. And monster cookies are exactly that. And so is Monstress. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for another week. Next week's story, we are exploring soil punk with the electric ant in its natural habitat. This one's going to be really fun. I cannot wait to share it with you. And until then, reach out on social media. Let me know your thoughts. Have you read Monstress before? Are you a super comic book fan? What are your thoughts? Let me know. Find me on Blue Sky at lizjbradley.bsky.social or Threads at lizjbradley. And you can find links to everything I write and my social media on my website, lizjbradley.com. I'll see you next week. Bye.